This is one of kind of the big black holes of history, is what's going on the Confederate side, especially with Longstreet's guys on the morning of July 2nd. I guess the standard interpretation is that Longstreet didn't want to fight on July 2nd, that he did want to move to the Confederate right, which would be the Federal left. I think that's certainly true the following day, and most of the contemporary record would support that. The movie, if any fans of the movie out there, that's kind of one of the bases of the plot is Longstreet doesn't want to fight. He knows better. And he does take that role on after the war as he comes under more and more and more criticism. So he plays into that. You can easily go find Longstreet saying exactly what they said he said. The difference is he says that well after the fact. There's no evidence that he's thinking that at the time.
Welcome to Heroes Behind Headlines. I'm your host, Ralph Pizzulo. Our guest today is author Alan R. Thompson to talk about his important new book, In the Shadow of the Round Top, which is a critical examination of controversial events that took place during one of the most important battles in U.S. history, and the one that determined the outcome of the Civil War, the Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1st to 3rd, 1963. For decades since, many historians and scholars have laid the blame for the Confederate defeat on the shoulders of Lieutenant General James Longstreet, and specifically his countermarch of July 2nd. Deconstructing soldier accounts, myths, and misconceptions, Alan R. Thompson has taken a fresh look at Confederate decision-making that fateful day and the narrative that has been formed to explain the Confederate defeat. To help us better understand what happened at Gettysburg, the dynamic between Confederate generals, including Longstreet and Robert E. Lee, and to remind us that memory is anything but objective, we welcome author Alan R. Thompson. He's today's hero behind the headlines.
Heroes Behind Headlines with Ralph Pizzulo.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what led you to look into this subject the way you did? Because you obviously spent a lot of time doing research once you kind of latched onto it.
Yeah, absolutely. So real quick personal background, I'm an attorney in New Jersey, and a solo practitioner. And so that, I think the law training certainly helped a little bit with the research process, finding different sources, different places, really trying to cite everything like I would in a legal brief. In legal briefing, it's a little different than some other subjects. Every fact that you cite in a legal brief, you have to provide a citation directly to somewhere in the record or an exhibit or something like that. So that certainly helped. And so that's kind of the personal background. The subject background, I've always been a history buff. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of goes without saying, but and so I really wanted to write. I always wanted to write something, so I started doing some research on July 2nd, second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. It's really, in my opinion, the turning point. Pickett's charge gets a lot of the attention. Yeah. But that's, to me, that's really where the turning point was. There's a lot of really specific niche works like the one I just did, and I really just do the whole thing. So the best place I thought to start was the reconnaissance in the morning at dawn. Chronologically, that's a good place to start, and that's where supposedly everything went wrong. Mm-hmm. The reconnaissance gave false information to General Lee. He used that information. They set up a plan, and the plan didn't work. The day fell apart. Mm-hmm. It's just one of those things people talk about. This was a problem, and then they move on. But we don't really know much about it. So it's one of those. It's an enigma, and we don't know why anybody did what they did, but they did it, and here's what happened. So let's talk about that.
Right.
So I went to the back of the books and the sources of some of the one-volume sources, and And I said, okay, well, here's what they're using to cite. Let me go get these letters. So I reached out to the Virginia Historical Society. So they sent me the letters. I looked through them and I said, well, this doesn't really say. There's a lot of assumption in the secondary sources. They say, okay, well, maybe I'm missing something. So I got the letters, I got the speeches from McLaws, and it's like this just didn't seem to add up.
Yeah.
So I did some more digging, and I wrote an article just on the reconnaissance, and I got some good feedback on it, which is always nice when you jump into a Gettysburg topic where everybody knows pretty much everything. So I said, okay, I'll check into Johnston's biography. You know, I found a lot of interesting things, and it ended up being there's some stuff that I left out, but most of the bio that I was able to discover, a lot of that's in the book.
Yeah.
And so there's just not enough for a full length bio. So, but that opened up other questions. So Johnston, we know Sam Johnston primarily from his reconnaissance. His contemporaries knew him for the counter march.
Yeah.
Leading Longstreet's First Corps into position and supposedly getting lost, turning around and causing a delay. That's where he came in, is because of an argument because of that. So I guess the recon led to an interest in Johnston in general, which then led to, well, the counter march is really where he was known in his life.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was really a link there. So I said, you know what, I went to find more info. It just wasn't there. I said, I just have to know what happened or what I think happened.
Yeah.
And so I went and found as many sources as I could.
Okay. That's great. Let's go back just to set it up for the readers a little bit. Can you talk about the events that led up to the Battle of Gettysburg and why it became so critical, not only in the war, but in the history of our country?
Yeah, absolutely. So the nutshell version,
mm-hmm.
You know, I think a tour guide once told me that it was very easy for him to do an 8-hour tour. It's very hard to do a 1 or 2 hour tour because there's so much out there, and you got to, what's the important stuff? So at risk of getting in trouble for somebody saying I missed something important, the nutshell version is Lee decides to go north. He's in Virginia. He's fought a couple of battles in the same general vicinity. You know, not the exact same battlefields for the most part, but along the same general line. Very successful in September the year before, or in August the year before, which sparks the first movement north, which is in September of 1862.
Mm-hmm.
That leads to the Battle of Antietam,
mm-hmm.
which is considered the bloodiest single day in American history. So that's considered a tactical draw. He falls back to Virginia, sets up a line. It's in December of that year, the Battle of Fredericksburg,
mm-hmm.
Smashing victory for the Confederates. They spend the winter there. The next spring, the new Union commander, they tend to get replaced after every battle at that point. So the new Union commander is fighting Joe Hooker, and he actually manages to get a successful flank march around Lee's army and catches him pretty much by surprise. Lee is able to recover. Part of that is poor leadership, unfortunate circumstances on the Union side. At the end of the day, Lee ends up winning the Battle of Chancellorsville. Stonewall Jackson's famous flank attack around and surprises the Union Army. Stonewall Jackson is also mortally wounded at Chancellorsville.
Yeah.
He's shot by his own men while he's doing his own reconnaissance of the front.
Yeah.
And so that prompts a reorganization of the Confederate Army. So Longstreet keeps his corps, but there are 2 additional corps. Before Gettysburg, there are 2 Confederate corps at Gettysburg, and there's 3. And so there's 2 brand new corps commanders. Lee essentially says, I can't stay here. Each battle's getting progressively worse. I can't keep living off the land. Let's move north. That will do a few things. And there is some debate about the specific reasons and what his primary motives were. But generally speaking, is looking to accomplish a decisive victory in the north.
Yeah.
That will either destroy the Union Army militarily, so it's not a fighting force, Napoleonic, victory, so to speak.
Yeah.
Or a political victory.
Yeah.
Which is going to destroy. You win a big battle in the north of Washington. You threaten the major cities: Baltimore, Washington, Philadelphia, Harrisburg, the capital of Pennsylvania. So that's going to, even if you don't destroy the army, maybe you get the the politics to go your way, and you cancel funding for the war, public support, so you can't carry it on whether your military is strong enough to do so or not. Think some of our recent wars, you have Vietnam thrown in there. You have to have a political will to fight a war, and if you destroy that,
absolutely.
And then you also get supplies. You don't have to rely so much on the southern supply chain. You can rely on and pick up supplies from the north. Let them contribute to your army a little bit. What the prime motive is, you can have a whole separate podcast on that if you want, but there's a lot of disagreement there, but those are some of the primary points to hit. So it moves north June 3rd of 1863. So they spend almost a month marching north. It's a very successful campaign for them. They do pick up a lot of supplies, and they sort of, not that they're out there acting like, pirates on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, but they're terrorizing the North. There's a lot of panic in the North. People are sending horses and supplies and money, and banks are closing down and sending them further north. They, plow through kind of the speed bump armies, if you will. Some of these ancillary armies, smaller armies, not the ones you think about, in popular memory, but and they're just on a roll. And Lee gets to central Pennsylvania, and his army is split. So he's got one corps, which is Longstreet's, which we focus on here and I do in the book. He's west of Gettysburg. You have part of another corps north of Gettysburg and part of another corps east of Gettysburg, and then a little bit closer to Gettysburg than Longstreet, but still west of town, you have A.P. Hill. And so they're all moving east to various cities. And when word of the Union Army being in or approaching Gettysburg reaches Lee, he consolidates his army. So they're all moving back towards Gettysburg. And that's what starts the battle, is this Lee is consolidating, and Meade, the Union Army commander, is moving up to, again, depending on who you ask for various reasons, but 2 corps end up in Gettysburg with about 2,500 cavalry on the night before. So July 1st starts the battle, and they just keep feeding troops in. Then Lee decides, what am I going to do next? He goes through a couple of plans. Contrary to the movie and some of the popular opinions today, Longstreet is not wanting to move around to the right and just real adamant on what the plan is.
General James Longstreet, who served as General Robert E. Lee's principal subordinate and Lee called his, quote, old war horse, was born in Edgefield District, South Carolina, and attended the United States Military Academy at West Point from 1838 to 1842 as part of a class that included future Union General Ulysses S. Grant. Longstreet fought bravely and was seriously wounded in the Mexican-American War. Although he had reservations about secession, he offered his services to the South. Many of Longstreet's most well-known victories came in the months after Robert E. Lee assumed command of Confederate forces in mid-1962. At the Battle of Second Bull Run, Longstreet's forces executed a devastating flank attack that nearly destroyed Union General John Pope's Army of Virginia. During the Battle of Antietam, the single bloodiest day of the Civil War, Longstreet mounted a defensive stand in which his army repelled a Union force nearly 2 times its size. His skill at fighting from defensive positions was again showcased during the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1962. By making creative use of the terrain, digging trenches, and constructing fieldworks, Longstreet's forces were able to withstand repeated offensives from the Union Army, resulting in a convincing Confederate victory.
He decides, tell me where to go. He says, moving to the right would be a good idea. Lee says, I thought about that already. We looked into it, and it's just not feasible. And he says, okay, where do you want me, boss? And so he says, get your troops up to supporting distance. and we'll tell you where to go in the morning. So Longstreet, by all accounts, does that. He's about 2 to 3 miles, depending on where you personally are in Longstreet's corps. It's about 14,000 guys. You're not all in one spot.
Right.
But he's between 2 and 3 miles away.
Yeah.
Which is exactly where you want to be at midnight in supporting distance the day before.
Right.
And so Lee's got a plan for July 2nd. And because we're July 1st, they win the day, they push the Union Army back, and now they have a plan for July 2nd. July 2nd's initial plan is kind of a pincer movement. If you're familiar with the layout of the Battle of Gettysburg, the battlefield, Cemetery Hill's kind of the main focal point of what both armies are trying to either protect or take. Culp's Hill is just to the to the east of that, northeast, if you will. And then the Confederates are supposed to swing around to the existing Confederates, not Longstreet yet, are going to be a little bit to the south, and they're just going to kind of squish them together. That changes very quickly as things go wrong.
Right.
But that's how we get to the morning of July 2nd.
In general, the Union has the higher ground here.
Yeah.
Which turns out to be a big factor.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Height is definite, especially for the artillery. The artillery platforms are going to be very good for the Union Army. On foot, depending on what you can see. Somebody once told me the biggest, the most important elevation in infantry battles is 6 feet, because then after you go 6 feet too low, you can't see anything ahead of you, and it's 6 feet. So
right. But these were, I guess we could characterize them as like gentle hills. They weren't like mountains or anything, but enough elevation to give the North like a decided advantage.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so that morning, certain things take place that later on became very controversial.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, there's a lot of things. This is one of kind of the big black holes of history, is what's going on the Confederate side, especially with Longstreet's guys on the morning of July 2nd. So I guess the standard interpretation is that Longstreet didn't want to fight on July 2nd, that he did want to move to the Confederate right, which would be the federal left, and move south.
Yeah,
I think that's certainly true the following day, and most of the contemporary record would support that. The movie, if any fans of the movie out there, that's kind of one of the bases of the plot is Longstreet doesn't want to fight. He knows better.
Yeah.
And he does take that role on after the war as he comes under more and more and more criticism.
Yeah.
So he plays into that. You can easily go find Longstreet saying exactly what they said he said.
Right.
The difference is he says that well after the fact. There's no evidence that he's thinking that at the time, and most of the evidence points the other way. So Longstreet is not really acting slow. What's going on is about 4 o'clock in the morning, give or take. And that's one of the things we get into kind of in the prologue. Is time is not something you can pin down. I mean, it's really neat to see some of these books, and some of them I've used as sources. It's not saying anything against them, but you can't accurately pin down a minute by minute account of any of this stuff.
Right.
It's really a chronology that we're putting together.
Right.
And so, but it's roughly 4 o'clock in the morning that Lee gets word that the people are not in position on Culp's Hill for that northern part of the pincer movement. And that not only are they not in place, they can't get into place because Union troops are on the hill that they were going to use as the stepping off point for the pincer movement.
Yeah.
Not only that, there's Union troops coming up to prevent those Confederate troops from moving anywhere. So they're essentially stuck north of town, an entire corps. And so that's a problem for Lee. So now he's got to think of another plan, and he's trying to think of something relatively quick. Now he's on the fly. Now he's aggravated. And that's one of the ongoing themes of the battle as well. One of these things that you see over and over and over again is Lee is aggravated. Lee is anxious.
Yeah.
That's been attributed to his diet.
His health is bad. Yeah.
He did have diarrhea, not to be blunt about it, but he did.
Yeah.
That's going to make you irritable when you're out in the middle of a field and nowhere to go. He did have heart issues are certainly something that people take into consideration. I personally think that those certainly are things that are going to aggravate you. But on top of that, and probably to me more importantly, is the fact that he's got this plan in place and now he's got to change it immediately. And there really aren't any good options at that point.
You point out another thing in your book, which is that, the communication wasn't great. And also there were all these moving parts. So there are all these people arriving at Gettysburg from different areas, encountering different delays and different problems. It's not like they all had walkie-talkies and they could just get on them and go, hey, I'm here. I ran into a creek or something like that. We're going to be a little bit delayed. You get this sense of Lee kind of wanting to put all the pieces in certain parts of the landscape, but yet, not really having a contemporary full picture of what that is.
Exactly. That's 100% accurate and a really good point. There's a great visual representation of exactly what you just said. Jedediah Hotchkiss, I said it wrong. He's one of the sources I used as well. And he's well known. He's a well known map maker. He's got his diary basically make me a map of the valley.
Oh wow! And
he was Stonewall Jackson's map maker and his engineer. So he's up north with that with the Northern Pincer Movement, which is Ewell's Corps.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at his map, it's incredibly accurate and detailed for the parts that he has access to.
Yeah.
And then it's just kind of some hills over here. So when you get down to the part where we're talking about, there's nothing there.
Yeah.
It's very nondescript. And another point on the point that you just make is that's why Johnston goes on his reconnaissance is when Lee is trying to figure out where am I going to attack. One, he's seen Union troops coming up from the south. He knows Union troops are coming in from the east, and you go to Gettysburg, and the first thing you see is Little Round Top. Depending on if you're anywhere on the southern portion of town, Little Round Top and Big Round Top those are kind of the dominating features of the landscape.
Yeah.
But if you stand on the Confederate side of things, and again, you don't have you have some binoculars that are okay for that time, and you don't have drones, you don't have satellite, you don't have anything. All you have is your eyesight.
Yeah.
And what people are reporting to you can't see what's between the road. That Emmitsburg Road's kind of the dividing line, no man's land, if you will. You can't see what's past that, between that and the Round Tops. You just see kind of the road and then the hills rising up from the road.
Yeah.
And so that's the ground that you're going to traverse to attack.
Yeah.
And for plan B, now that you need a plan B.
Yeah.
Now, one of the interesting parts to me was that had been contemplated the day before. So they've seen part of this ground the day. They know that the slopes, like you mentioned, the gradual slopes on that side versus they're not steep. They're not, you're not needing mountain climbing gear to get up there, but they're much steeper on the other side than they are for the side they eventually attack, which leads them to come to the conclusion that's a better place to attack.
Yeah.
But they also don't know, are there any troops there, and what's between that road and the Round Tops where we're going to have to attack from. And so that's what prompts Johnston to be called, is he's actually investigated the same ground that he the day before in the evening. A less famous reconnaissance. He mentions it briefly in a letter, and a couple other people briefly mention it. Again, it's just part of the job. You're not going to write every single thing down that you do. So Lee calls him and he says, I need you to go investigate the Union left flank. Is it still where we thought it was from last night? Have they increased their the troop levels down in that area? And what's the ground look like? Are there roads to get there? Can I maneuver troops? Is it swamps down there? Is it?
Yeah.
So that's his goal. And so he's to fill in that blind spot that you said. They don't have radios or Google Earth or satellites. The only maps that they really have are not topographical maps.
Yeah.
They're road maps. But if you look on the map they're using, which is the 1858 Adams County map, you can go get it as a souvenir in the gift shops. Now you can find a high def online. You're going to see all of the roads, and you're going to see none of the no contour lines. You have no idea that Little Round Top is there. You won't find Little Round Top or Big Round Top on the map because it's just flat. And so he needs to know what's going on
Right.
over there. And that's the point of the reconnaissance, because and the timeline matches up.
Yeah.
Again, exact times we're not going to know.
Right.
But the timeline matches up where they find out that they can't do plan A. They revert back to the original plan A from the day before, which is now plan B.
Yeah.
And they need to investigate to make sure. So that's what prompts the quote, famous or infamous, depending on where you fall on it, reconnaissance that Sam Johnston does.
The area of military engagements during the Battle of Gettysburg covered the majority of the town area, with Union troops generally holding the higher ground, north, west, and south. Directly south of Gettysburg rose the gently sloped Cemetery Hill. Eastward were Culp's Hill and Stevens Knoll. The two highest battlefield points were at Round Top to the south, with the higher summit at Big Round Top, the lower oval summit on Little Round Top, and a saddle between. The Round Tops were rugged and strewn with large boulders, as was Devil's Den to the west. Big Round Top steep slopes were heavily wooded, which made it unsuitable for sitting artillery. Though Little Round Top was unwooded, its steep and rocky form made it difficult to deploy artillery en masse. Union forces generally held a strong defensive position on Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and Culp's Hill, which made it difficult for the Confederate forces to attack and take the high ground.
That kind of leads itself into the second part of it, which is where Johnston was known at the time, and that's that countermarch. The idea is that, like you said, you're going to move 14,000 troops to essentially the rear of the Union Army. We often interpret it as the left flank because that's where it ended up being.
Yeah.
But at the time that Samuel Johnston, the engineer and the scout that goes and does that reconnaissance, it's essentially the rear of the army that they're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a couple of interesting quotes, just kind of, peripheral quotes, not, and I find to be the most honest.
Mm-hmm.
So nobody's looking directly at it, trying to make a point. It's just kind of a throwaway comment.
Yeah.
But in his, in one of the most contemporary letters or accounts that we have is McLaws.
Yeah.
McLaws is the lead division in Longstreet's move to attack off to the Union left.
Yeah.
And so he's right at the front, and he gets blamed for a lot of stuff. So he's one of the main accounts that in this whole countermarch delay argument. And so he says, the whole point is to be there without being seen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what causes the whole thing is not to be seen. And the one that really throws Johnston under the bus, if you will.
Yeah.
He says that Johnston, eventually concedes that his reconnaissance was probably accurate. It's delayed. You're there at 6 o'clock in the morning, give or take.
Yep.
And the attack starts at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. There's a lot of things that change.
Yeah.
But McLaws writes home to his wife on July 7th, 3 days after the battle, they start retreating from the battle.
Yeah.
And he says that the intention was to get nearly in the rear of the Union Army.
Mm-hmm.
And so in his mind, before all this controversy starts, they're supposed to attack the rear. Then it eventually drifts into, well, this was the left, and that's because they're remembering how it actually was. And by the time they attack, it is the left, but the intention is to attack the rear.
Right. They just never got there.
Well, and that and the Union line moved.
Yeah.
Where they attacked, at 6:30 in the morning was the rear of the Union Army. But then you throw in Dan Sickles, who always is good for starting a controversy in Civil War crowds. He's a character in and of himself. But so he actually moves his troops. The order is to extend it further south to Little Round Top. So they still wouldn't have been in the rear at that point. But Sickles takes it upon himself or interprets his orders differently, whichever side of this you want to fall on. I don't want to make anybody mad, but eventually he moves his line up to the Emmitsburg Road, which is about 3/4 of a mile in front of the rest of the Union troops. And so when the Confederates attack, they're not anywhere near the rear anymore. Now they're solidly facing the left of the Union Army. And so you don't have a flank or a rear attack anymore. Now you have almost a head-on attack with a little bit of that on the flank. So it's a much different attack, much different position. But it's interesting to me when he mentions that it's the rear, because that to me tells me that Johnston got to where he said he did, which is another part of the controversy. And also that the intention was to have a slight flank and rear attack, not to have the attack that actually happened. So they have to adjust on the fly.
Right. There was a lot of adjusting on the fly on both sides, but especially on the Confederate side, because they keep running into, once the plan, and in your book you talk about, like, the plan wasn't set until about 11 o'clock in the morning. Is that correct?
Yeah. Again, back to that time, 10:30, 11:15, but that late morning is probably, I think I come down on the 11 o'clock side of it, but late morning is fair.
Okay. So at that point, then you've got to really, on the right, you pretty much have things in position, but on the left, there's a lot of maneuvering that has to be done because there are still troops arriving. And also you've got to move them through this area that has just been reconnoitered, basically, and like, as you pointed out, like, this isn't their territory. They don't know the roads. They don't know the streams and the topography that well.
Exactly. And that's, that's one of the controversies, is who's investigating the roads, who's not investigating. If you were the scout, why didn't you investigate the roads, and why did you lead us this way, and
right.
And again, that all comes about well after the war, that controversy. But on July 2nd, you have a small group of scouts, and everybody tends to forget, not that they forget, but we talk about Johnston and his reconnaissance. He had a couple of other people with him. And that's its own controversy. Who went with him? Why didn't he name names? And so I get into that a little bit in the book of who I think that's certainly open to interpretation. But that's his job is to scout that area, and he does that. And he actually probably reports, again, we don't have his actual report. There is no report. So anytime you see in the kind of the standard accounts, Johnson didn't report any troops there. We don't know what he actually reported. We can only guess.
These were verbal reports, right? They weren't written reports.
No.
Yeah.
The closest we get to what he said is Johnston himself saying,
this is what I reported. Yeah.
15 to 30 years after the battle. He writes a couple letters in that range. I told Lee about the topography. I told, I showed him the route I went over, but he doesn't say what he saw, who he saw, where. He says I got to Little Round Top, but that's also 30 years after the battle.
Yeah.
I think everything lines up that he did, but nobody was there. We don't know. That's one of the big arguments in these, the campfire circles here is, did he get to Little Round Top or not?
Yeah.
And so, the spoiler for the book is I think he does get to Little Round Top, but it's explain why, but that's but from there you can see what you need to see. He reports back, and if one of the things that Johnston repeatedly says that he reported back, not the troops that he saw, but the lay of the land, the topography. And so to me it's interesting that once Lee gets the report, all accounts agree that he then goes to the other side of the battlefield where the pincer movement was supposed to start. So he goes up to that sector, which to me indicates that he wasn't real happy with the lay of the land and the prospect of attacking over that ground.
Yeah.
And so he goes back to the north, says this is even worse.
Yeah.
And then he's really aggravated. And all of the accounts say that at that part of the day, he is steaming.
Yeah.
And most people, especially the Confederates that saw him and were with him after the war, of course, when this whole political controversy is broiling over, are going to say, well, he was mad at Longstreet because Longstreet wasn't in position. But he's not, because Longstreet hasn't been ordered anywhere.
How could he be in position? Yeah.
So I think Lee's mad that none of this is working out. His good plan,
it's not lining up,
ended up being the worst, the better of two options, and neither one of them are ones that he wants to take on.
Yeah.
And so he eventually comes back and he basically tells Longstreet, fine, this is where you're going to go attack down this way.
Right.
We want this to be kind of a surprise flank attack here. Try not to be seen if you can.
Yeah. And that's Lee's decision.
Yeah.
Longstreet is kind of going like, hey, I don't think this looks so good. His tendency was to wait for the Union to attack the Confederates, like to fight a defensive battle.
Well, that's definitely one of the interpretations of Longstreet. In this particular instance, definitely on July 30th, his heart's not in the attack. He doesn't want to do it. He's late.
Yeah.
Here, I mean, on July 1st when he comes up, so now the night before again, he's the commander. His troops aren't up at the battlefield, but he is. He meets with Lee.
Yeah.
And he does initially say, why don't we move off to the right and move further south? Kind of that whole popular opinion. And Lee says, we actually thought about that. That's a good idea, but practically that's not going to work. There's a lot of reasons we can't move our troops that direction overnight. And so Longstreet basically says, okay, well, if you look at it, then I believe you.
Yeah.
And so I don't get the impression from looking at the contemporary stuff that Longstreet has any qualms about the July 2nd attack.
Okay.
And what Lee wants to do. That's definitely the I'd say the standard interpretation. But then he does have to make changes and alter his plans a few times. And so I'm sure everybody's frustrated at that point.
Sure.
But it's not based on the original plan, and we should have moved south, or we should have, been a defensive battle. Because Longstreet's two best days of the war are Second Manassas and Chickamauga, which is in the fall of 63, a few months later. And those are brilliant attacks.
Yeah.
And so he gets the reputation of being a defensive general.
Yeah.
But he's very good with an attack, and that's why he's put there. There's a reason.
Yeah.
And in order to say that, Longstreet is awful and is a terrible commander and he's not good at it, you have to also be saying that Lee doesn't know what he's talking about and picking his commanders.
Right.
Because why would he do that?
No, and this guy stuck with him for a long time. I mean, he wasn't just appointed the day before the battle. So he was a tested general and highly respected one. Yeah.
And he's very well respected. There's a day that you can pinpoint where he becomes a respected general to the most hated person in the Confederacy, essentially. And that happened in June of 1867. Where he writes an article. And but before that, you can literally days before that, they have articles that say, "Oh, our gallant General Longstreet, here's a toast to Longstreet, and he's one of our most successful generals and beloved son of the South." And all the great stuff you'd see about any other generals.
Right.
We're up there with Lee, Jackson, Stewart, Forrest, and all of these Southern icons. Longstreet's up there until he admits, or in his mind, he says that the Confederacy fought the war to preserve the Southern way of life, not for any abstract political movement, not strictly for slavery or not slavery or what. None of the standard causes. A lot of the Confederates at that time were saying that, well, we seceded only, we were only really fighting for the right to secession, not so much any of this other stuff. And it's and maybe some of them were, but Longstreet takes a position, and he takes it publicly, very publicly, that we fought for our way of life, and I'm a soldier, and when you win, you get to keep what you have, and when you lose, you have to do what the loser or the victor says. Yeah. And we lost. Yeah. So our principles lost with us. And so we have to abide by whatever the North says. He said, I'm a soldier. That's what it is. And that's what the Southerners, the prominent Southerners can't abide. They can't, we did not put our culture, our way of life on the line. And we can sit here today and we can say, oh, well, the Southern way of life. There's a lot of things you can say negative. The primary one being slavery. Yep. You also have a pretty tight caste system, so you're not moving up or down socially very much. There's a very old, English aristocratic lifestyle back then. So if you're at the top, life is great. Sure. But if you're not, then it's not so great. And so that's good, bad, nostalgia. I'm not here to, we're not criticizing the South per se, but you can understand whatever your thoughts on the South were, why the other side comes about, because that's your life and your lifestyle and your culture. You're going to defend it.
Sure, anybody would. Yeah.
Right, wrong, or otherwise.
Yeah.
You just have to know. And Longstreet is attuned to the fact that he's not a political guy. He can't really read a room very well.
Yeah, it's probably not the most politic thing to say, but he's just being honest. This is how I feel. We fought hard, we lost, we came close. There's a lot of nobility there on the battlefield and bravery, but this is the new reality and we have to adjust to it.
Right.
So this is really kind of the turning point, like in your book, because whatever happened on the 2nd, which I think you've laid out like really well, the history is written later. And as you're pointing out now, Longstreet starts to become the villain of the battle. Yeah. And you attribute it, and I think correctly, to positions he took after the war. And that sort of changed the whole narrative, or it colored the whole narrative of what was written after the war.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a little bit of a dividing line, I think, anyways, in history studies, where you have the tactical studies, we'll call them the traditional military studies, and then you have the historiography.
The inability to discover the truth does not rule out its objective existence. As author Alan Thompson points out, there's a distinction between historical truth and interpretation or personal narrative. The first is objective, and the latter is subjective. There were no video cameras to capture what really happened during the Battle of Gettysburg. In a process he calls sifting, Alan Thompson sorted through all eyewitness accounts, compared them, analyzed individual motives and personal agendas, and tried to approximate the truth.
How does a story develop? And I don't think you can have one without the other.
Yeah.
You especially, you don't have anything to develop. You don't have a narrative to develop without the events happening.
Right.
But on the flip side, how you get the story of the events is how you're going to interpret the events. So it's not, you don't have a camera sitting there, or you don't have the sky cam from the NFL sitting there just following the battle around, and you're just kind of taking notes and who went where,
and you can replay it and so on and so forth and zoom in and all that stuff.
Yeah, all we have are the memories of these guys.
Yeah,
and I make a point in the book to say that even if we had cameras back, we have cameras, but we're taking still photos of the aftermath. So that's very valuable for a resource.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't have video.
Yeah.
You don't have action photography. You don't have video photography by any means. And even a video is not entirely objective.
Yes.
The cameraman's pointing that video somewhere for a reason.
Right.
Again, the closest you're going to get to an objective, account is putting a video camera on each side of a battle line and then just looking at both of them. Mm-hmm. So that's, but we don't have that.
Yeah.
And so the closest we can do is see what they wrote. And as I was going through this, and anybody who's ever even approached this subject, the very first thing, the first 20 minutes of looking into this, you're going to see that not only the accounts differ a little bit, they flatly contradict each other. And then those sources will contradict the other source that you can find, and then those sources will contradict each other themselves.
Yeah.
So McLaws will say one thing, and then he'll say another thing, and then he'll say another thing in a different account, and sometimes he'll say the exact opposite in his own account.
Wow.
And he's not the only one, but he's just the one that he's most prominent in this story. So,
right.
So literally after so many sleepless nights of just, what the heck happened? Something happened.
Right. Well, we know something happened.
But we don't have that objective camera. So something is not right here. A plus B equals C.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, you got to go back to square one and say, well, I don't have A or I don't have B, or have something that looks like an A or a B. So something's wrong here.
Right. And there's another part of it too, which you talk about in the book, is that you don't know people's motives, right? And the
Right.
personalities, because when it gets into the counter march and some of these other things, you've got two generals with egos, and one wants to go first and the other one thinks he should go first, and they end up like clogging up delaying the whole thing. And you would think, well, that can't be strategy. Well, it's not strategy. That's not the way it was planned. But those were the guys you had, and they had histories, and they had egos, and they had reasons why they felt the way they felt. And, hey, this is the result. So in a sense, if you just looked at it, you go, well, this doesn't make sense. But then when you add the egos and the motives and so on and so forth, well, then it does make sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a big part of the book, and really kind of one of the keystones, or the can't come up with a term off the top of my head, but the final stone in an arch, that holds everything in place.
Right,
Once we kind of came to a conclusion and we found some of these things, so the two you mentioned, McLaws and John Bell Hood, they had this pretty, I'd say, vicious in the sense of words, rivalry. And Hood is this overly aggressive, I would say overly aggressive general. He's the other division commander in Longstreet's corps, so it's him and McLaws are the two division commanders. Hood has already blamed McLaws in the past for that battle at Antietam. If he had showed up on very similar to this controversy, if he had showed up on time, we would have won the battle.
Right.
And after Gettysburg, if McLaws had just been there on time, we would have won the battle. And so this seems to be a thing. And right or wrong, McLaws gets this reputation of being slow and just not very aggressive. He's a solid, steady guy, but I really sympathize with McLaws. I think he's probably a really good guy to know. He's a pretty good general. He's just doesn't have that flair and elan that you associate with a Confederate army in the East. He's not Stonewall Jackson. He's not Jeb Stuart with a plume in the hat, and so he's solid. He's steady. But he doesn't have any flair. So, and Hood is the opposite. Hood is, Kentucky-born Texan, and he's got this flair. He's aggressive, go, go, go. Later on, that gets him in trouble because he's overly aggressive. He's got this amazing attraction, or Northern-made bullets have an amazing attraction to him. He ends up getting shot pretty much every time he goes into the field. He gets severely wounded at Gettysburg, doesn't lose the arm, but he loses the use of it. He loses a leg later on. He's just really shot up in literal sense of the term. But he commands an army out west later on in the war, out by Atlanta against Sherman's guy, and he doesn't do well, not at all. So, but him and McLaws have this rivalry. And McLaws, till the day he dies, I mean, one of the last things that he writes is like the late 1880s, and it's going back and saying how he was not late at Antietam, darn it. And Hood was wrong. And then so there's this whole history there. And when McLaws is supposed to be in the lead at marching to Gettysburg, he gets himself on the road and he finds out that who's already marching and passing his troops by is Hood. And McLaws is on time. He's not late. He's just, Hood has gotten there before. And he's like, Jesus, and they're literally fighting. And Longstreet, both of their commanders, on June 3rd, the day they start the Gettysburg campaign, there's a letter from Longstreet to McLaws saying, well, if you're really that unhappy, I'll help get you out of the army. And part of that unhappiness is his feud with Hood, saying that he sucked, because they're writing each other back and forth. Hood writes an apology the end of May to McLaws, and McLaws, there's no record of if he had accepted it or not, but it doesn't seem like he did. And this is as they're stepping off to go on to what ends up as a Gettysburg campaign. And these are the two guys that are in Longstreet's corps. And then Longstreet has this ability later on. I'm not a Longstreet hater, but I'm also not a Longstreet, if you will, fanboy, to use the term. He's a person. He does well sometimes. He doesn't do well sometimes. He's got great personality traits. He's got bad personality traits. And depending on where he is in his life, some are going to take over more than the others.
One would think that since Generals James Longstreet and Lafayette McLaws had known each other since their days at West Point, the pair were friendly. But that was not always the case, and their rancor towards each other became evident at Gettysburg, when General Longstreet ordered General McLaws 4 brigades to get into position to attack Union forces in the Peach Orchard, and McLaw objected, complaining that Longstreet was exceedingly overbearing. But as author Alan Thompson points out, Longstreet had good reason, including McLaw's delays and him taking a route that exposed his troops to Union forces. Despite their disagreements, years later after General Lee's death, when Longstreet was being blamed for the loss at Gettysburg by Jubal Early, William Pendleton, and others, McLaws defended his old commander, writing, and I quote, "I think it is a grave assumption to assert that because Longstreet's corps did not assault at daylight, the Battle of Gettysburg was lost."
So while I don't think he did that much bad stuff at Gettysburg, when he gets out on his own, he gets out, later on in the war.
Yeah.
He and McLaws have this huge falling out, and he does have a tendency. One of his bad traits is to push blame off onto somebody else, to his subordinates. Yeah. And McLaws is the senior subordinate, and he starts to take a lot of Longstreet's blame. Yeah. Well, now you have Longstreet and McLaws and Hood as some of the primary players in this post-war thing. So you have this whole mix, this cauldron. I like to say, if you're trying to put, and this is not getting political, I promise, it's just to make the point. If you're a historian 150 years from now and you want to figure out what happened during COVID-19, and all you have are 2 New York Times op-eds, a Fox News clip, a speech by Trump, a speech by Biden, a Fauci memo, and a couple of emails from people going back and forth. You got like 10 sources that you think, I know what happened. But look at your sources. We all know how biased all of those sources are on one side or the other.
Right. Yeah.
But you're 150 years from now, I think, well, I got all of the, and they're first person accounts.
Yeah.
If you've ever taken, a history course and your teacher, professor says, you want first person accounts, contemporary accounts. Well, you have them and you think, I got everything. I got great. This is fantastic. I know what happened.
Right.
But you want to begin to know what happened. And it's kind of the same thing here. Yeah. So you have an account from Hood in 1875. You have a couple of accounts from McLaws. You have an account from Johnston, and you have a little bit of accounts from Longstreet. Well, that doesn't get you very far.
These are the guys who were there. They fought the battle. They would know, but they still have axes to grind with one another. The other part you talk about is how after the war, Lee became a sort of a figure that you weren't allowed to criticize. He became, the symbol of the glory of the South. So you couldn't question anything he did. So it had to be his subordinates.
And that's exactly what causes this. It causes many controversies, but focusing on this one, that's what causes this controversy. Is you have one side saying that well, you guys went the wrong way.
Yeah.
And McLaws, who's afraid that Longstreet's going to come after him, he says, well, if I went the wrong way, it was only because Lee's guy, Johnston, the engineer who's on Lee's staff, he was leading us the wrong way. His scouting report was wrong. And not only was his report wrong, he led us the wrong way.
Yeah.
Like he was the one leading us.
Right.
And so that becomes, again, this whole chronology. You can kind of piece everything together as far as the story collecting itself into what the standard story is today.
Yeah.
McLaws said, well, if we were to blame, well, it was your guy. And so then they go back, well, our guy, said that. And then so it's this back and forth, and everybody's just completely missing the point.
Yeah.
And to Johnston's credit, I wish he did, because we'd have more accounts about
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
But maybe I don't, because then it would have been answered. I wouldn't have the opportunity to study and write the book. But for my own curiosity, I wish that Johnston had written a little more. But at that point, he's in his own career. He's a railroad guy. He's not getting into the politics of this stuff.
Yeah.
And he just wants to move on. The war did not do well for him. He's destitute after the war.
Yeah.
He goes from a just below like aristocratic level, very high middle class, if you have such a thing at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But he goes from that level. He's got an estate. He's just married. He's got a career budding, and then he comes home from the war and he's destitute. He owes thousands upon thousands of dollars. And for context, he buys half interest in a few hundred-acre estate for $9,000.
Wow.
So he's $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 in debt after the war.
Yeah.
He's lost his house.
Yeah.
His firstborn son died. And so he's not doing well. Then he gets kicked by his horse. He's laid out for a while. So finally he lands this job, and literally within a couple of months of landing this job, Longstreet, the second in command of the Confederate Army, says, "You lost the war for us because you led us the wrong way." and in a national paper. I mean, this is this is not something an op-ed written for the Alligator Swamp Times. This isn't like the Philadelphia Weekly Press. So one of these guys sends him a copy of this thing, and he's like, "What?" Yeah.
What the
so
hell?
he sends them back a response and says, "Please don't publish this." And so he promptly publishes it. As part of his defense of what Longstreet said. So Longstreet writes this thing, then, Lee's nephew, who's, writes this, then McLaws writes this, and then you have all of these people coming in, and all of a sudden they forget what happened. It's just, this is your fault. It's your fault. It's your fault. And at this point in time,
right,
Longstreet is already essentially the Judas of the South. He's betrayed the Southern cause by saying that the Northern principles were right. And there's I think it's one of Jubal Early's, and ironically, Jubal Early, he's sort of takes the banner of all of this. The Lost Cause today has a really political overtone, but back then, Early actually coins the term Lost Cause. And so from a standpoint of what he's referring to, this idea that we couldn't win the war because we just didn't have the truth. It's almost this, romantic notion of kind of Thermopylae, the 300. There's no way we can win, but look how heroic we were,
right,
fighting for what our beliefs were in our civilization.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, when I say lost cause, not the political connotation of today.
Yeah.
So Early is the lead figure there in that, and he sets up this religious narrative essentially that, like you said, Lee is God, and you can see the connotations. I use a bunch, but those are only a little tiny fraction of the apotheosis language that they use.
Yeah.
So if Lee is God, Longstreet is his right-hand man.
Yeah.
He's a second in command. He's actually a higher ranking general than Longstreet, technically. Or than Stonewall Jackson, rather. So Longstreet's second in command. He's the right hand of, and what does he do? He betrays Lee, and then he takes it on himself to say, "My idea was better." So his ego's getting in the way. So he's got this fall from grace.
Yeah.
This very Lucifer style. And then if Longstreet hadn't fallen from grace, if he hadn't taken that leap, well, the problems, they would have won the war. So literally all of the problems of the South. This Garden of Eden going awry, this biblical narrative, and it's not me implying all of this from a couple sentences.
Yeah.
You read his speeches from the early 1870s, he flat out says it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he's setting this all up, and so Longstreet really becomes Lucifer, and the cause of the original sin, the original problem of the South. All of the wrongs of the South are from Longstreet.
Yeah.
And Early, I think, says somewhere, one of his first two speeches in that, he says that he's essentially Judas. Judas portrays Jesus, and then they said, but Judas had the decency to at least hang himself afterwards.
Wow.
As a Longstreet does have too much of an ego to
so
do
he's
that.
even lower. Yeah.
So that's Longstreet at this point.
Wow.
And so so you have this back and forth, and really what happened that day. Most of the narratives that are on point with what happened are all from that debate.
Yeah.
About who lost the war for the South.
Right.
Right. And so putting it back together to go back to July 2nd really involved taking a whole range of sources from diaries on both sides and letters they wrote to each other, official reports that they submitted. And you might get one little nugget here and a little fraction here.
Right.
And you're putting this puzzle back together. And a lot of it's peripheral stuff. Like I said, they're not talking about it on point.
Right.
They're just talking about something else. And that can be placed into the puzzle, and you can kind of glean something from there. And when you put it all together, you can kind of see what the story was. And some very biased sources actually end up being good sources, not for the part that they're talking about that's biased, but for some of those peripheral things.
Yeah. Very interesting.
There's a lot of sources that talk about Lee being aggravated, like we mentioned before.
Yeah.
Well, you can get all of these aggravated, I saw Lee and he was aggravated. And it was Longstreet's fault because he wasn't there. So where is Longstreet? Why isn't he there? And you can kind of dismiss that part.
Yeah.
But also where is Lee coming from when he's aggravated? What is he doing when he's aggravated? And you can get rid of the op-ed part of that from the person.
Yeah.
And say, okay, well, Lee's coming back from Cemetery Hill. Well, he only went to Cemetery Hill after he talked to Johnston. So you can piece that. Well, Johnston reports, and then Lee goes up. We know that. And then he's coming back from Cemetery Hill.
Yeah.
And then that's right before he orders the attack, and he's aggravated. Well, he's not aggravated at Longstreet. He's aggravated at
what he saw,
the situation.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how you get that, piece together.
Right.
There's a little more to it than those sources, but that's kind of the approach I took. I took lawyers, God bless us all, we're trained that if somebody plops they plop a case down on your desk, and that's the side you take.
Yeah.
The other side could be right. Yeah. But this is the side you take.
Yeah.
And, as historians, when lawyers become historians, and again, they mesh pretty well the studies because of the training. But there does tend to be the accusations that lawyers tend to prove their point. They have something, their theory, and they tend to prove it. And that's not entirely wrong, but I used that, but also kind of a little bit of a scientific method approach, where let's get everything on the table itself. Yeah. And let's figure out what this all says. And so that's kind of the...
Yeah. Well, I think if you come at something, which, it feels like you did in a pure way, where you're not taking a point of view in the beginning, right? You're just going, okay, this is what all the history books said, but I'm just going to look at all the evidence I can and just try to figure out like what really happened here, and whether I end up here or there, like fine, I'm not related to Longstreet or Lee or any of these guys, right? I want to get a more accurate picture of what what took place, right? And to me, that's the genius of your book is that you do that. And it feels very grounded and fair.
I definitely had the benefit of there really weren't positions drawn on this so much. There's a couple of small ones, like did Johnston get here or did he get there? Everybody's got their opinions on that. But, for the most part, this really was a black hole of history, if you will. There nobody knew. I mean, that was kind of the standard interpretations. We think this is what happened, but for the most part, we don't really know what happened. There aren't sources. We have the couple of speeches that outline what it is, but we don't really know any of the whys, and we don't know a lot of the whats. Yeah. There's a lot of wheres that we don't know too. So I mean, there were a lot of open questions. So I think that was beneficial, that it wasn't, well, I have to take a stand and I have to pick a side and we got to argue that. Right. Where a lot of these places already have like we talked about Sickles and Longstreet, so their sides drawn already. And it's a little bit ironic that one of the artillery officers in Longstreet's corps, actually his family lived at the intersection that they came out at.
Yeah.
The Wentz farm,
Yeah.
today, WNTZ. And that's there's the real popular story of Wesley Culp, who was killed on his uncle's farm and all that. Culp's Hill, which is the hill that the pincer movement's supposed to start on. He's killed on the second or third. There's a solid evidence to which one he was killed on, but he's killed and down the a couple of fields over, if you will, from where he spent time as a kid. And what his relationship to Jenny Wade, the only civilian killed during the battle, immediately during the battle. There's others wounded and hit by exploding shells, farming their fields in the months and years later.
Yeah.
But she's the only one actually shot and killed during the battle.
Wow.
And so there's this whole little love triangle between there, and that her supposed secret lover was good friends with West Coast. So there's this whole personal you have this guy Wentz, who his family lived right next to the peach orchard, which is where they're supposed to hit their attack.
Yeah.
And one of the big mysteries, and it'd be a great thing for somebody to dig into and see if they could find more information on. But why didn't anybody say, hey, don't your family live there? Yeah, we the guy who literally lives here.
Right.
And so that's always been one of those, well, why didn't they do that? And I didn't get into that. That was beyond the scope of what I was delving into.
Yeah.
But it's always been interesting. One of the things too, I think, in the standard story is that the scouting of the roads is a big piece of that. And Johnston is usually named as one of the people. Well, he scouted the roads. He should have known where they went, and he had to have been leading them the wrong way. Well, if you look at the map and you look at where the troops were, they're literally a few hundred yards from the road that leads directly to where they need to line up.
Yeah.
And so not being there is one of, I guess, the biggest places that my book kind of deviates from the standard. There's obviously a lot of places, but one of the big ones is, were they seen, and why were they seen, and who saw them?
Yeah.
And why did they turn around to begin with?
Yeah.
The standard story is that they got to this place. Again, they're not supposed to be seen. They get to this rise, and they look up and they see these signal flags waving in the distance from Little Round Top. Oh my God, we can't go that way. They're going to see us. They're going to report us. We got to stop and turn around.
Yeah.
Now where do we go? And they march, and they lose, depending on who you ask and when you ask them, anywhere from an hour to like 4 hours of time. And so they start the attack too late. But one of the points I make in the book is that you really can't see anybody on Little Round Top without the assistance of binoculars or something. Yeah, and at the time, their binoculars would have been sufficient. But if you've ever ridden on horseback, it's not even a gentle gait. You're bouncing a little bit. You can't see. Your eyes can't focus, and you can't. The only thing you can see at the distance they're at, which is about 2.5 miles, is basically reflecting light.
Yeah.
So you can't see anybody. You can't see people. You can't see shapes. You can just see lights.
Right.
And so you're not going to stop in your tracks seeing signal flags waving and people and like 2 or 3 guys standing on Little Round Top on top of a rock. But there is a skirmish going on. One of the little, I don't want to call it a side story because it's more than that. You have to go a little bit deeper into the battle to have it become a more prominent story. It's skipped over a lot in the overviews. And there's a sharpshooting unit, Berdan's sharpshooters, and a main unit and some cavalry guys that get into it with the rest of the Confederates, not Longstreet's guys, but they're coming down and moving into position, and Longstreet's going to move in next to them. And those guys, the very tail end of those guys, right next to where McLaws is supposed to go, that's the guys he's supposed to be standing next to. They're getting into this big scrap with the sharpshooters, a couple of cavalrymen, and the 3rd Maine Infantry. And so there's and most of the guys mention it. They call it a sharp firefight over and over again, and on various parts of the line. And so that's happening right in front of them.
Yeah.
So they get to this rise, and if my chronology is correct, which I hope it is, I think it is, but it's open to debate. Then that's happening right before McLaws crests that ridge where he's supposed to be seen. So I think that will stop you in your tracks. And from that point, I think he takes binoculars out and he's looking and I got a signal flag, a signal station up there.
Yeah.
I can't go this way anymore. Where do I have to go?
Right.
So then he goes for help, and then it goes from there, and they decide, well, we can't go this way. We got a counter march. Why don't you go the way that the other guys went?
Yeah.
And that way it'll get you into position without being seen. You don't have to cross this open field where not only will these guys see you, but the signal guys will see you. And so let's counter march. The people they ask for help are people that are accusing them after the war of losing the battle. So you can't really admit that you stopped and you went and you asked these other guys for help. They're part of the Lee crowd at that point.
Right.
So when you're telling the story again, you can't include that part. You got to have something else up.
For 3 days in July 1863, Union and Confederate forces clashed in the largest and bloodiest battle of the Civil War. Casualties have been estimated at more than 51,000. As devastating as those numbers were, only one civilian was killed as a direct result of the fighting. Jenny Wade, a brave, kind-hearted young woman who had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. A few days before the Battle of Gettysburg began, as a vanguard of Confederate troops rattled through the town, helping themselves to supplies, Jenny's sister, Georgiana Wade McClellan, gave birth to her first child. Jenny went to the McClellan house 5 blocks away on Baltimore Street to help her sister and her newborn. Although townsfolk were frightened, they thought the armies would pass them by. On the morning of July 3rd, Jenny was in the pantry of the McClellan house kneading dough to make bread for Union soldiers when a single bullet passed through 2 doors, penetrating her heart. She died instantly.
One of the things I get into, it's kind of the underlying theme, is just the human psychology and memory is specifically.
Right.
And that's really important because we talk a lot about national memory when we talk about historiography and how we remember things like Gettysburg. Like we said at the beginning, all we have are the stories the memories these guys wrote down.
Right.
So if you don't know how memory works, and you really get in, I didn't when I started this, and I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a scientist, but I'm trained to research how you perceive things at the time gets stored into your memory.
Yep.
And then you have to recall the memory. And there's a lot of intervening factors between storing the memory and pulling it back out from storage. And all of those things most of the negative factors are going on when they're trying to recall these memories.
Yep.
So one, you have poor perception to begin with. You're in a battlefield scenario. So you're very focused. One of the reasons why, if you take like a GoPro and you look at it, or you have one of these, Saving Private Ryan type, where your head's moving all around like that on a daily basis, and you're not generally getting dizzy when you walk, and you're not bouncing around, and it's because your brain is regulating that, almost like a steady cam, and it's also picking apart, like what you said. Oh, I thought it was a bird. I didn't see the guy. Your brain is inputting things and processing things. It's not processing every single thing. It's leaving a lot of this stuff out.
Right.
And so when you look at it back on a GoPro, your brain is now seeing everything because you're not the one engaged in it. So your brain is just watching like on a TV. But when you're engaged in it, your brain is filtering out what's important based on what's been important in the past.
That's exactly right.
You're missing a lot.
In the military, they call it like situational awareness.
Yeah. And even the situational awareness trained person is missing things. They're just trained to focus on certain things. So things that are happening outside of that training and the rewiring of the brain, which is really what that training is, are missing other things. So I do a quick overview of just some memory things to say that when I bring up things later on in the book that I'm not lying, or just trying to make it sound and fit right. But people conflate things, and your brain is not a compartmentalized like a we're both old enough for the card catalogs, in the libraries and the schools. It's not a card catalog where you're just pulling things that are very well organized. Your brain is basically a slush fund, and it's everything goes in, and then somebody else's memory goes in, and you're talking to a war buddy, and that memory goes in, and then people are reporting stuff on the news, and that goes in, and all of a sudden you go to pull this memory out, and all this other stuff is stuck to
That's
it,
right.
almost like those fly
paper, yeah.
traps, you know,
Yeah.
and it's going to catch stuff, and it's
Yeah.
I didn't mean to catch all of this, but this is my memory with all this other stuff
Right,
on it,
right.
and you think it's yours, and it's actually not. And you can actually see it. One of the most well-respected contemporaries is Edward Porter Alexander,
Mhm.
and he comes into he's one of the bigger ones for the countermarch stuff. He has nothing to do with the reconnaissance, but the countermarch stuff, he's a big one of the major accounts on it. Well, he wasn't part of the countermarch, but what he was he was tapped by Longstreet right after the war to write a history of the First Corps.
Mhm.
And so he is reaching out to hundreds of participants, and he has all of these other accounts that are essentially tainting his account.
Yeah.
And so his first person account, when you start to piece them all together, you realize, well, this one reconnaissance he says he does is actually 3 done over the course of 3 hours, but he says he goes on a 3-hour reconnaissance.
Ah.
And so they conflate all of these things.
Yeah.
And I mean, I like to tell people, you know, if you're for like a live audience or something, and saying, okay, well, you know, tell me about your weekend last weekend. And when you start to think about your own the chronology of events, you say, well, did that happen?
Yeah.
Or did I do then? And you're not thinking about it.
Do that with a friend or your wife and try to recall the same weekend.
And then do it 15 years from now.
Forget it. Yeah. Yeah.
And
yeah.
I mean, they've done stuff with 9/11, you know, stuff that we can relate to, you know, and people have this tendency to think, well, it was Gettysburg. It's the biggest battle of the war. It's a battle. Yeah. It's important. You're going to remember it.
Right.
Well, they've said you actually probably have less ability to accurately remember important things because so many other people are talking about it.
Yeah. And also if you're caught up in the trauma.
And the traumatic events do have, you know, for various reasons and various events have, you know, you can go to the repressed memory route. You can say, well, you're not perceiving things accurately because of the panic level. There's a lot of reasons and a lot of different views on why people don't remember traumatic events. And certainly a battle is this.
Oh my God.
We have the benefit of knowing that, well, this wasn't so much, you know, this was kind of leading up to the battle, so it's a little bit calmer.
Yeah.
But it's still, there's anxiety. There's a lot of things going in. There's sleep deprivation. Yeah. And then everything's happening at once.
Yeah.
Right. And what's interesting to me is when you're studying this stuff, and if you focus on the time aspect, because I have a little, you know, couple page segment on time and how they, you know, and one of the things that's interesting to me is looking through that was almost all of the participants will mention something about, well, I didn't have a watch. I don't really remember what time it was. I think that remembering the sun was about halfway in the sky. And even Johnston, that's one of the big things about what time he went out there. And Johnston will say in his first letters where he gets the time kind of down and where we come up with a time. And then on later accounts, he goes back to his first and says, oh, well, that was the time I went out. But he says, he doesn't mention the time at all. He just said early in the morning. So then the person reading him the letter says, well, what time did you go out specifically? He says, I don't remember, you know, and I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but he's like, I don't know. It was, I didn't have a watch. And even if I did, I wasn't checking it. And things, you know, the anxiety and the 20, it was about dawn. I don't know. Let's call it 4:30.
Yeah.
And so 4:30 became the time.
Right.
But he's hesitant to give a time at all. So you have that. So that input, first off, which are the reasons we talked about, trauma and anxiety and sleep deprivation, your perception, your storage to begin with. You're not storing a pristine, you know, perfect image to begin with.
Yeah.
And then you have all of the things to taint the image.
Yeah.
And then you pull it back out and then you put it back in. And when you put it back in, you're putting it back in as a memory. You're remembering the memory, how you told it.
Right.
And so you pull it out enough times and it becomes, you know, the memory of what you said, That's how you get the fishes bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. That telephone game. And so you have all of that going on. And so you have to be careful about it. And none of this is to say that anybody's lying, because I don't think most people are.
Yeah, no. They just remember it differently. Yeah.
And they will all, we have some, you know, quotes that you see over and over and over again in these things. And if you go back and you expand the quotes, most of them have some of those modifying language in there that,
Mhm.
well, to the best of my recollection, I don't really remember.
Right.
It's tough to say,
Yeah.
but they're not. So one of the things I like to for the history, nerds, fellow history nerds out there, that I tried to go in, and I would say most, I'm sure not all of them, but most of the quotes I've put in the end notes in a little bit more full version, so you can see. So a lot of these things are kind of obscure. A lot of Civil War researchers will have a lot of these sources. You'll be able to find them. A lot of them you can find online.
Mhm.
Archive.org,
Mhm.
a great source.
Mhm.
But some of them are pretty obscure. And a lot of them you got to go to a library to get. You got to order. A lot of these university libraries, they'll email you a high definition scan. Some of them will still mail them to you.
Wow.
But that's and then you got to transcribe them. They're not always that easy to go find. So I tried to give an expansive, without quoting the whole thing,
Yeah.
and you have copyright stuff, but
Yeah.
to give at least a little bit more context of just the quote and say, well, just trust me, I wrote the book. It's that's the last thing I wanted to say, because that was kind of what sparked the whole thing. Like we said in the begin with, was
that's right.
They said this thing and it wasn't really that. And
Yeah.
the other thing too, I put in there was each citation is pretty much its own citation.
Mhm.
There's not a lot of paragraph size.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a lot of paragraphs in the notes. That's kind of its
No,
own
but you pare it
mini
down.
book. But
yeah.
it's where each source came from, and
Yeah.
there could be a few points that they're just made over and over and over, and to kind of emphasize the fact that everybody was saying this.
Yeah.
I'll give you, all of the sites are kind of laid out there. But
Yeah.
you won't get one of these. Well, let me go and get 15 different sources to figure out which one of that string citation is the one I'm looking for.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted people to be able to do their own research to continue it if they wanted to as well.
Great.
And
it's great
to kind of a second guess, or, if they wanted to, or what have you. But
well, the bigger irony for somebody like me who doesn't, hasn't researched this history at all, really, just, read histories, is that all the focus was put on the delays on the West. The East was sort of ignored, right? And they were delayed too.
Yeah.
And this is supposed to happen simultaneously. That was the whole point of the strategy in the first place.
Yeah.
So they couldn't patch holes. They couldn't move people around.
Right. And that's one of the another big controversy, again, a little bit outside of the scope of what, part of something I'm working on at the moment. I don't know, no timelines, no contracts, nothing, just kind of without the pressure of having to produce something immediately, which I don't think leads to, or not that it can't lead to something, but I think it hinders it a little bit. You can't explore it as much, but that's definitely, and to me, even more important is that delay on the North the night before. That miscommunication. Again, I don't like to point blame at people. I try to explain why I think things happen, but I think everybody's trying to do the best they can, and things happen. But the delay in getting the troops onto Culp's Hill on July 1st, whatever the reason was,
that was a big thing.
The delay itself is the cause of all of the stuff that happens on July 2nd. And if you don't have that, then there is no July 2nd.
Yeah, because Lee almost assumed that they had taken Culp's Hill.
Right. And it's 4:00 in the morning when he finds out they didn't, and now it's too late to move anybody around.
Yeah,
and that sparks all of the action that we talk about in the book.
Yeah,
is because he, John Sin, no T, is a division commander in Ewell's Second Corps, and he's not in position. There's a lot of reasons for that. Part of it is just, again, its own delays with terrain and darkness, and the maneuvering places on time and getting places in the dark and trying to find the right spot. And other parts of it are probably some miscommunication in what the expectations of him were to be.
Yeah,
I think he probably thought that he was supposed to be in position to take Culp's Hill in the morning, when really he was supposed to be on Culp's Hill at night. And so I think there's a little bit, whether he justifiably misunderstood that or not, that's right. Other people can debate that.
Yeah.
But that is the cause of that delay and not being there when Lee thought they would be there is what caused all of the things that happened on July 2nd,
Yeah.
which then leads to its own accusations of delay, obviously. And,
Yeah.
so again, I think if you had to describe Gettysburg in one word, if on the Confederate side anyways, I think it would be entropy.
Yeah.
Just things will devolve into chaos when left to themselves.
Yeah.
And it takes an awful lot of effort and an awful lot of luck to have everything just end up exactly the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
And, more times than not, things are not going to end up the way you plan them.
Yeah.
And things just fall down. So so I think that's how I explain it. And it's not one person's fault, but we're humans.
Yeah.
And that's how our brain works.
Yeah.
And we like stories in that day and age. I mean, less so than today, or more so than today.
More so. Yeah. Yeah.
The Bible is your source of narrative, your stories. That's where your connection is.
Yeah.
That's, and so I don't think to me, it shouldn't be a huge mystery why it ends up that way, but we perceive things in stories and narratives, and that's how we like to remember things.
Yeah.
That's how I got into the history to begin. I saw the movies and I said, this is cool.
Yeah.
And I want to know more about it,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't have just picked up a history book and said, oh, let me figure this out. There's a story. That's why we write in narratives. That's why stories are good.
Yeah.
And so, but that's how it ends up happening is you have delay and delay and delay and delay. And then you got to find a reason for it. But life doesn't unfold in a narrative. We put it back together in a narrative.
That's
and so
key.
I tried to kind of,
that's the key.
Take that, we try to remove the fog of war to tell a story. And I was trying to put the fog of war back in.
Yeah.
To see what they would have thought and seen and been able, and why did they make the decisions? You don't know the why until you put that fog of war back in.
No, I think you did a great job. Really great job. I really enjoyed it.
Well, I really appreciate that. Like I said, it's intimidating to jump into this,
I would
especially
imagine.
such a controversial aspect of it.
Yeah.
So anything nice anybody wants to say, I'll graciously accept, but I really do appreciate it.
This is great. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, as far as, you could ask my wife. I'll talk about this all night if you want. But I know we won't. But no, so I guess the only thing I would say is, I just encourage people to continue to research it. It's, I would like to think it's the final say, and people have been kind enough to use words like definitive, but it's that's a great, it's an ongoing,
of course,
discussion, and I enjoy talking about it. So anybody that wants to email me is welcome to.
You have a great quote here right in the beginning by Peter Abelard, who was a philosopher, I think from like the 12th century or something like that. A monk. He says, by doubting we are led to question, by questioning we arrive at the truth.
Exactly.
So let's just keep questioning. As for the reasons the Confederates were defeated at Gettysburg, Alan R. Thompson concludes that it wasn't the delay in General Longstreet's attack on the July 2nd, as many have said. Instead, a thorough comparison of eyewitness accounts points to a lack of Confederate numbers and cooperation. General Lee himself maintained that the lack of simultaneous attack on the Union line was a primary reason for the Confederate loss. Because the Confederate attack was piecemeal, the Union Army was able to pull troops from other positions in their line to plug holes. And Alan Thompson points out that the argument that says if General Longstreet had attacked earlier on July 2nd, the Confederates would have prevailed is irrelevant because he was not supposed to, because General Lee hadn't decided when or where the attack would be made until it was too late to launch a morning assault. We thank Alan R. Thompson for comparing veterans' memories and sifting through the factors that affected them to bring the history of the important Battle of Gettysburg into sharper focus. For this and his important new book, In the Shadow of the Round Tops, we honor him as today's hero behind the headlines.
Heroes Behind Headlines. Executive producer Ralph Pizzulo. Produced and engineered by Mike Dawson. Music provided by Extreme Music. For exclusive content, please join our Patreon group at patreon.com/heroesbehindheadlines.